Like many other cities across the country, Leeds grew rapidly in the Industrial Revolution as floods of workers left the farms and came to work in the teeming factories and mills of the modern city.
Leeds was a city of firsts in medicine too, with medical pioneers working right here in this great city.
In this week's edition, Jonathan Strait and me, Mark O'Brien, are finding out how the Industrial Revolution may have brought with it previously untold prosperity, but this came with enormous new threats to the public health of the country. So let's put their stories under the microscope and see how our early medical pioneers transformed life on the streets of Leeds. On Streets of Leeds, we get in the front seat and head out on the road to go and find out how Leeds has changed and transformed over the centuries, from its roots as a market on a bridge through to its success as a centre of the Industrial Revolution, to its status today as a major British and indeed global city. So Jonathan, we know that Leeds played a big role in the Industrial Revolution, but it came at a cost.
Well, it did. I mean, as the population of Leeds grew, what we found was the governing classes, the people with money, they lived in certain parts of the city in their big houses with lots of green spaces, but the poor lived in damp housing, poor quality housing, often built in the back-to-back style, and there was a lack of running water, sanitation, air and water was polluted, and open spaces were generally filled with rubbish. And the result of that was a lot of illness. I mean, we have this quote from Charles Dickens. He says Leeds was a beastly place, one of the nastiest places I know.
Lovely, isn't it?
That is lovely, isn't it? And we have another quote from a doctor in 1832 who said that no more than 10% of the population of Leeds was actually in full health.
That's an incredible statistic.
It's bad. And I mean, it was worse because if you were poor, you had to pay to get treatment.
Of course.
And this became a bigger problem as the population was growing and as more diseases were coming along because of the deterioration in the environment. That was all changed by William Hay, born in Pudsey and one of 5 physicians who established the Leeds General Infirmary, firstly in a private house in Kirkgate in 1767. This was for the relief of the sick and hurt poor. Money was raised from merchants and doctors for this purpose. Then more money was raised and a purpose-built facility opened in 1771 with almost continuous expansion to try and keep pace with demand. This was no second-rate facility though. It was described at the time as one of the best in the kingdom. Hay became the senior surgeon here and pioneered a number of operations, as well as giving his name to the Hay's saw used for surgery on the skull. This building by Sir George Gilbert Scott is one of the finest examples of Gothic revival architecture in Leeds, and it was opened in 1869 by the Prince of Wales. Now, ahead of its design, the architect and the chief physician visited several hospitals overseas for inspiration, deciding upon the pavilion plan as recommended by nursing pioneer Florence Nightingale. Now, this involved improved ventilation, separation and segregation of patients, lots of toilets and baths, and hoists to help the staff. It made a big difference.
Now, Jonathan, in 19th century Leeds, as you said, there wasn't much in the way of state provision in the same way there is today. There was a big reliance on philanthropy, wasn't there?
Well, there was this philanthropy to help the poor if they were ill, but actually not a great deal was done to stop them getting ill in the first place. And in 1832 there was an outbreak of cholera, an epidemic in fact. Now, cholera is not a disease we hear much about these days in the Western world, and if you did get it these days, you'd get better if you were treated, but then it was more than likely to kill you. Now, Robert Baker, he was the Leeds parish surgeon at the time, and he produced this map logging where the outbreaks of cholera were and whether these places had clean streets and drains. And what he found was the areas where the streams used for drinking water were the same as those used for sewage, people were much more likely to die from cholera. But his work was ignored by the authorities for quite a number of years, and it was a long time before there was any improvement. Now, eventually the tide began to turn, and Baker was appointed Inspector of Factories in 1858, and he then had responsibility for 2 million workers in the 23,000 factories across the north of England. Another campaigner for the health of factory workers was Charles Thackeray. Thackeray was the town surgeon in Leeds. He also became an educator, establishing a school of anatomy in 1826 and the Leeds Medical School in this building in 1831. The medical school has since moved but continues to be part of the University of Leeds to this day. Although he is not well known for his work, his research proved to be an instrumental part of the passing of the Factories Act in 1833. This aimed to address child labour, with under-9s banned from the workplace and under-18s allowed to work no more than 10 hours a day, still pretty horrendous by modern standards. There had been Factory Acts before, but this one was the first to establish an inspectorate, ensuring that this legislation would actually be enforced. Thackeray's research showed that there were 50,000 factory workers in Leeds by 1830, and something like 1 in every 100 of them would die prematurely each year from their working conditions or the general environment. Not great odds. He also published a book detailing the risks of more than 100 trades, along with recommendations for improvements. But sadly, disease cut his own life short. He died of tuberculosis at the age of 38.
So, of course, Jonathan, we know that Leeds has had a lot of firsts. We've seen them all in this series. But it also had some medical pioneers as well, didn't it?
Well, indeed. I mean, let's talk about Sir Berkeley Moynihan. He grew up in Leeds. He entered the Leeds Medical School in 1883, and he was actually a pioneer of abdominal surgery. Now, at that time, there was very little knowledge of antiseptics or the need for sanitary conditions in the surgery. The surgeon would tend to wear a mucky apron, do the operation with his bare hands. Now, Moynihan worked in Berlin for a little bit, and he was appointed as surgeon at the Leeds General Infirmary in 1896, and he insisted that his colleagues all wore whites to do their operations and rubber gloves. These are groundbreaking changes, and they're actually still followed today. Now, one thing not a lot of people know about Moynihan is he had enormous hands. Now, so much so that he had to have special instruments made for him by the local manufacturer, Thackeray. In fact, it was Moynihan that persuaded Thackeray to start manufacturing surgical instruments in the first place.
In 2017, the Leeds General Infirmary marked its 250th anniversary, a quarter of a millennium since the institution first began in that private house on Kirkgate, there for the relief of the sick and poor. The LGI has been at the forefront of the development of medicine and surgery in Britain, a pioneer in all kinds of radical techniques, from aseptic surgery to the UK's first kidney and hand transplants. Today, there are so many forgotten old corners of this vast Victorian ziggurat that you or I might never even set foot in. But if you walk through the doors now, then you might come across this brand new timeline that pinpoints the seminal moments in the history of the hospital.
The number of medical firsts, the number of pioneering medics and nurses that have come through the LGI, that have benefited the advancement of medical treatment and care, not just in Leeds but across the whole of the country. right up to the present day, where we're leading the way with things like the UK's first double hand transplant. So that tradition continues, and I think that pioneering spirit of innovation and high quality care continues, but we stand on the shoulders of giants in that regard, and I think that's what makes the LGI special.
Join us after the break as Jonathan Straight explores the Thackeray Medical Museum, finding out about the harsh realities of daily life in Victorian Leeds. And as I find out how 21st century Leeds has become a major centre in the fight against one of the biggest killers in the Western world. Before the break, we found out how Leeds has been the home of a great many medical firsts, from the labour of Robert Baker, the Leeds parish surgeon who mapped cholera in the early 19th century, discovering its connection to the dirty streets and streams, to the pioneering surgical work of Sir Berkeley Moynihan. And we discovered the roots of the Leeds General Infirmary, now one of the foremost centres for medicine in our region. But now it's time to explore how medicine developed for ordinary people in Victorian Leeds, and how Leeds continues to be a centre for pioneering developments in the fight against the biggest killers of our age.
The Thackeray business was started by Charles Thackeray, who started with a single chemist's shop on Great George Street. This was directly opposite the Leeds Infirmary and was also near to many of the doctors' consulting rooms. Initially, Thackeray repaired surgical instruments, but eventually started making them. The business grew to be a world-famous supplier and was a leading innovator in making implants for hip replacements. In 1990, the business was sold to the American DePuy Company. They continue to produce hip replacements in Leeds, and Paul Thackeray, grandson of the founder, used some of his share of the proceeds of the sale to establish a medical museum in Leeds, which opened in 1997. The Thackeray Museum is in a building which opened as the Leeds Union Poorhouse in 1861. It housed 784 paupers, but was later used for the medical care of the sick and then became part of St James's Hospital. So this is all about how Leeds was in the 1840s, how absolutely disgusting it was to live in the city. Let's go have a look.
I urge you to go and see this squalor for yourselves.
So look at this. In 1839, Robert Baker, we talk a bit about Robert Baker, he says of 586 streets in the town, only 38 had sewers. Must have been terrible. So there was this big clean-up because things got so bad, and we can see that drinking water was supplied here by 1860. 95% of houses in Leeds had clean drinking water. Housing was improved, the sewers were improved, very few houses didn't have sewers, and air pollution, well, that was still a problem until the Clean Air Act in 1956, but certainly big steps were made in terms of water and housing and sewage. You know, the thing that strikes me looking around this museum is this. We think our medics are the bee's knees. We think we really know and understand medicine. And yet we've seen some incredible things here, like surgery without anaesthetic, like the perils of giving childbirth, and many diseases that were completely misunderstood for many, many years. So it'd be really interesting to come back here in 100 years' time and see just how well we really did understand medicine in the early noughties.
I often wonder what exactly would be the abiding image of Leeds today. Would it be Bridgewater Place, the jewel in the crown of modern-day Leeds? Would it be Ellen Road, elephantine as it is, glowering at visitors that get off the London train when they're coming north? Or would it be the rows upon rows of dark red brick terraces that spread every which direction out of central Leeds? Once upon a time, some of these red bricks were derided as slums. The slums of Leeds had a long history in the city, going back several hundred years. They were squeezed into the nooks at the heart of town before growing out inexorably with the influx of workers from the countryside to the city. There was little in the way of planning to cope with these new arrivals, so as the end of the 19th century approached, it was time for the council to take action. Compulsory slum clearance began as far back as the 1870s, and although an Act of Parliament in the 1900s ruled that back-to-backs had to be replaced, a loophole meant Leeds builders were still putting them up in the 1930s.
But even though these slums were often dirty, filthy places with shared outdoor toilets, open drains, uneven flags and cobblestones, they were often very popular. Locals at the time often spoke of their community spirit with all sorts of people brought together, and they'd work really hard to keep them neat and tidy, their own small patch of Leeds.
The building housing the Thackeray Museum formed an early part of what became St James's Hospital, an institution which was reputed to be the largest teaching hospital in Europe in the 1970s and which gained fame through the television series Jimmy's. But the first building to open on this site was this one. It was opened as the Moral and Industrial Training School in 1848, and it now forms part of the Lincoln wing of the hospital. The poor and destitute were looked after by funding from wealthier people, and some were housed in so-called houses of correction, which eventually became known as workhouses. By 1834, the system was at breaking point, with a large number of unemployed and less labour needed on the land due to technical innovations. A law was passed by Parliament that relief could only be given to able-bodied people if they went to live in workhouses. They had to work for their food and accommodation, and it was a tough life. The Thackeray Museum is housed in one such building, but these workhouses provided no special facilities for children. Eventually, these buildings were used for taking care of the impoverished sick, and from 1925 became St James's Hospital, with all the previous stigma long forgotten.
While once upon a time it was cholera, now it's another C word that looms over medicine and researchers. Today, it's Leeds scientists who are playing a key role in groundbreaking research into new radiotherapy treatments, taking the fight to cancer.
About 40% of patients who are diagnosed with cancer will receive radiotherapy as part of their curative treatment. And although we've seen big advances in radiotherapy technology, we are able to take that to a higher level because the computing and the engineering that goes into getting the best treatments for patients is advancing all the time. I think radiotherapy has dramatically improved over the last 20 years. So we've been able to use CT scans to actually target the radiotherapy treatment planning process, so we can be sure that we're actually treating the right spot. And we can also monitor patients during radiotherapy using a CT scan. But the next level that we want to take radiotherapy to is to introduce MRI scans to optimize the radiotherapy, and the research that we're participating in will be fine-tuning that approach of introducing MRI scans into the process of radiotherapy. So although radiotherapy may have a reputation for being fairly simplistic, technology has changed dramatically over the last 20 years and is changing even quicker now. And this research opportunity really is to actually harness that new approach and get the best benefit for patients.
But it's not only at the point of care that Leeds scientists and institutions are fighting cancer. The Leeds Institute of Cancer and Pathology is part of the School of Medicine at the University of Leeds, which brings together scientists and clinicians. Dr. Georgia Mavria is one of the people leading research into how cancers grow and thrive. Research that will help us to combat cancer and save lives.
So the work in our group is focused on understanding how tumors derive the blood vessels. So a cancer is like an organ, it needs blood vessels to grow. And so we want to be able to manipulate the blood vessels, either to deliver agents more effectively or to stop the blood supply and try to kill the tumor. So this is what we do. So we discovered a molecule called DOC4, which plays a very important role in the way the blood vessels grow in the tumor that has metastasized from the breast to the brain. So what was intriguing is that this molecule is not involved just in this process, but it's also involved in the process of migration, of movement of the breast cancer cells from the breast to the brain. So we decided to investigate this further. We brought together a multidisciplinary team, so researchers with different expertise, and put together a proposal to Breast Cancer Now to say what the next steps are going to be into finding ways to understand the role of this protein and see if we can target it in breast cancer patients.
So not only did Leeds have a huge impact on the industrial growth of the country, but there were also many people who cared about the adverse effect this was having on public health and who made it their mission to do something about it.
And this combination of philanthropic funds and medical innovation ensured that the sick got treated, but also meant that diseases which were once fatal became something that eventually many people would survive.
Yes, indeed, and these innovations had a dramatic effect not only on the rest of the country, but on the rest of the world, and they all began right here on the streets of Leeds.